Okay.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back after what I'm sure was a terrific session wherever you were. My name is Leah Kearney, and I'm a staff member at the ETFO Provincial Office. It is an honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Darlene Ciuffetelli Parker, who will be addressing the intersectionality of poverty on youth, effects of systemic barriers in education systems. Darlene is a professor at the Faculty of Education at Brock University. Her research program fosters deep understanding of diverse topics, including, but not limited to, poverty, race, identity, gender, ability, mental health, and the effects of systemic barriers in school systems. In the past, she has worked as a school administrator, a literacy consultant, and a teacher in Toronto with the Toronto Catholic District School Board. Her research is extensive and widely published, and she's received numerous awards, such as the Award for Excellence in Teaching at the Faculty of Education at Brock and the Institutional Brock University Award for Distinguished Teaching. So I thank her in advance for providing her insight and thinking with all of us today. And Darlene, may I hand it over to you?
Thank you very much, and hi everyone. And I'm not a Zoom user, so I have my assistant, Max Parker, that's going to share the screen. There we go. Oh, yeah. So, can you see the screen? Awesome.
And it's perfect.
All right. Oh, so thank you, Max. And I'm so happy that there's so many of you still here on a Saturday afternoon, the day before the big game or the halftime show. And I know you all want to maybe get on to your other parts of your weekend, but I'm so honored to be here. And I have been watching and listening from last night, and Rania and Jody and Nancy this morning and Charmaine. And so I really want to say that I want to thank Ian and Lindy and the crew at OTF for putting this symposium on. It's so important and it's so timely. So my talk today is on the intersectionality of poverty and youth. I have been doing research on poverty in school systems, probably from when I began my PhD work, and it was a longitudinal study in Regent Park, and I studied literacy, and I studied the effects of literacy on marginalized communities, and it really focused in on what I was living at the time, and then it resonated with my life experience. So I have to give a shout out to my supporters in this. This research doesn't happen just because I have support from Brock University, also the Social Justice Research Institute at Brock University, my partners, research participants, advisory board members from the Durham District School Board and from the Niagara Catholic District School Board. Also on the advisory board is the Ontario College of Teachers. I have a few also community agencies, nonprofit agencies like the Niagara Poverty Network Initiative. And we were invited to also be part of the Equity Network of the Ministry of Education for our work in our community of practice with this group. So a lot of my stats that I use before I get into the research and methodology that I use, particularly for my research program, comes out of the Campaign 2000 and reports that come out every single year. And the reports are called Campaign 2000 reports out of provinces across Canada and also in Canada. And it's no question that they had the report out in April 2020. Then they put an addition to that report in December 2020, because absolutely we have been living in unprecedented pandemic. And what do we do beyond the pandemic, rising up for a Canada free of poverty? For me and educators like me, realizing the effects of poverty in school systems, we know that issues like bandwidth, Wi-Fi, computer access, just resources at home to be able to do school-based work is limited for many families. But the pandemic has put a huge spotlight on that now. So now the mainstream society, not just in Canada, but globally, knows that there's a huge issue of inequity in our systems. And it is time. We cannot wait any longer. So how do I come to this research? So usually in narrative, and I'm going to be sharing my stories and how I do methodology in narrative research. You contextualize it by looking at yourself and how you contextualize the landscape where you live. I am a white privileged woman doing social justice work in my research and in my teaching. And I'm also a daughter of immigrants, and I've lived below the poverty line for much of my formative and adolescent years. In a very, very tiny rural town where I was known as and called the dark-haired girl, WOP, and with W-O-P, without papers. English was not my first language, and I only began probably speaking like English or reading fluently in English by grade 3. I almost failed grade 1. And I almost failed probably grade 2 again when I went to my parents' homeland for 6 weeks. And so this is important that I contextualize this, because through the years in my educational experiences, I felt the tensions, but I did not recognize that there were lack of resources and assumptions that people were making of me and stereotypings. This was my life. Fast forward in my teaching years in Toronto in richly diverse school landscapes, I learned deeply from my students. I remember Hawk, and I remember Olu and Victoria and Christina and all the students representing Black and Indigenous students of color and white students and immigrants and even refugees. And my students were my teachers as I began my teaching career. And mostly I recognized that there was a resonance of what it means to be marginalized, and low-income living was the common denominator between me and my students. So I use the term intersectionality. Kimberly Kreshton was, she theorizes, she's a leading scholar in critical race theater. I am not a critical scholar in critical race theory. But the term is being used. It's in many of our ministry documents right now. And I just want to quote Kimberly, and she says, if you don't have a lens that's been trained to look at how various forms of discrimination come together, you're unlikely to develop a set of policies that will be all as inclusive as they need to be. And so this is what it's about. Schools cannot solve poverty, but we can understand deeply the issues of systemic barriers. And so many of you know that our most marginalized groups have a direct relation to poverty. So right now, this number changes, but right now there's 1 in 7 children and youth living in poverty in Ontario. And of those, if you are an Indigenous student or child or youth, if you are in a gender of as a woman, especially as a single lone household family as a woman, if you're racialized, and if you're an immigrant or a refugee, or if you're a person with disabilities, you are more at risk to be living in poverty. And that is the data, and these are represented in our classrooms. So this is a quote from one of my own papers, but in my multiple years of research, I've studied elementary school systems across Ontario. I know ETFO is represented here, so thank you, ETFO, for supplementing all that work for many years. I traveled across schools, high poverty schools in Ontario, and researched, and we wrote some cases. And that developed into me really seeing schools across systems, not just in the system that I worked at as a teacher and then as a literacy consultant. And we heard the voices of teachers and administrators and parents. And in elementary, the schools in elementary, we decided not to elicit the voices of students, and that was missing. And so I was compelled, because I was teaching my uni students at the same time, and I have university students that also live in low income. And I wanted to hear the students' voices that are in high school, the youth voices. So I began another secondary project. And so what I know is that poverty is not just a statistic of 1 in 7 children and youth live in poverty. And statistics do not get to the poverty phenomenon that illustrate how it plays out in school milieus. So I have the most heart-wrenching stories of where things go really left and sideways in schools. And it based on systemic, sometimes discrimination or systemic barriers. And I have hero stories and stories of unique schools that you would never understand how that school would operate at such high functioning level of success, where students living in low income are the majority. I also study in schools that are mixed ability, mixed income. I also study poverty in schools that are known to be high income schools. And yes, I know Charmaine was speaking this morning, and I know the Possibilities book came out of the research that I did with Joe Flessa. That was so cool. But she reiterated again that we must not assume that there's no poverty in high income schools. There is poverty and pockets of poverty everywhere. And in fact, this is what I wanted to study in particular, are those mixed demographic, mixed socioeconomic schools, because that is where the barriers exist the most and where you see it the most. And I wanted to show and share a little bit of that today. So I wanted to, so I have a lot of voices of students. Today I'm going to go broad out and then zoom in. So these are just, this is a statement, and this is our first little activity that I want maybe just to, I'll read it out to you. And this is from Campaign 2000, just from December, a few months ago. As income inequality grows, the people of Ontario are counting on the government for support through the provision of income security programs, strong policies, universal childcare. Oh my gosh, I'm just hoping for that. And action to end discrimination and systemic inequities that make that much more challenging for families to move out of low income and into stable, healthy, happy lives. So I present to you this statement. And over the years, I've been doing this since 2005, studying poverty and education. Many of you, and rightfully so, educators and just stakeholders, nonprofit organizations, but especially in school systems, say to me, how can you expect us to end poverty? Schools cannot fix poverty. And absolutely, we do not. I wish we could end poverty. I wish it could be all encompassing, that school systems have that power to put systems in effect like security programs or universal childcare. That is up to our government to do that. But in this sentence that I've just read to you, which part of the sentence can school systems do? So I'd just like to have you read on your own that sentence. I don't know if you can put it in your chat, but there's just a stem there. And I'll give you maybe a few more seconds. What can schools do? We can act. We can act to end discrimination and systemic inequities that make it that much more challenging for families to move out of low income and into stable, healthy, happy. So if we begin with the yellow part that I highlighted, if we begin and we really focus on that, what can we do with our school plans? What can we do with our curriculum? What can we do with our school board mission statements and strategies, and work toward thinking and really talking about systemic inequities. And I want to show you that I'm not suggesting that we think the big things, how can we get rid of that? I'm asking you how to think of the little things, and that's what I want to show you and illustrate today. So before I get into the voices of teachers and voices of youth, I am very proud to have been working with various school systems together, publicly funded Catholic and public schools working together as a community of practice, at some point with the Ministry of Education, but at other points also with nonprofit organizations and other partners outside of school systems. So we have our mission to advance and to mobilize and to deepen our educator knowledge through the youth voice, through parent engagement, to actually reshape curriculum and how we do the business that we do with students. But to do it as well by having it begin with the classroom, partnering it with a school program, and then bringing it out to the community. And so we have 3 guiding principles for that. And it's about, and this is the key word, if you're going to leave this symposium with 2 words, it's change mindset. I think everybody's gotten that today. How do we change mindset? And let me tell you, I've been doing this work for many years. You can see that I'm older than you. I might think I'm a little bit older, but I continue to change my mindset, even though I am a social justice professor. My work and my teaching and all my courses are equity based, but I learn and I continue to learn. And just as an example, even in the fall with the Black Lives Matter, and I participated in the scholars strike, of that one-day scholar strike, and then my Black esteemed colleague decided to put on a symposium in the fall in October, and the panel was an all Black panel, and she tapped my shoulder and she said, "Darlene, I need you to speak about your work and how it intersects." And so I know we've been talking about this a little bit, certainly last night with Rania, and just being bold enough to step up and act is really important. I basically pushed back with my friend, Delana, and I said, "But what do you mean? I don't do anti-Black racism work." And she said, "You do that in the intersectionality, and you have a fantastic theory, and I want you to do it." And so I stepped up. It was one of the most advantageous talks that I gave, and it was only a 15-minute talk, but it was teaching me how to be an ally. And I'm still in the learning phase of how to be an ally. So that also is about shifting practices. My course syllabi have shifted this fall because of our society and because of our pandemic and because of our justice movement. And then the empowerment part comes in we joining with my colleagues for the justice that is deserved of all students that we teach. And so working together with 2 large school boards, I have researched intimately, I think over several years now. I'll just change it to the next slide. But 4 schools. One was a very rural, low socioeconomic school. Another one was an urban, low socioeconomic. Another was a suburban mixed socioeconomic, and another was an urban mixed socioeconomic school. And I collected data between 2015 and 2017, and again between 2016 and 2020. In fact, during the pandemic, because of what was happening, I reopened and I got an REB extension for one of my schools because I really wanted to hear about teachers teaching during a pandemic with systemic issues already on the forefront of their curriculum planning. And so with this data was over 200 participants during these years. And yes, this time I did incite the voices of youth. And not only were they part of my research, but they became, many of them, students as researchers, and they wanted to participate very, very intimately to actually have a voice. They came with me to speak at trustee meetings at school boards. They put on a youth symposium in 2017 at Brock University, where we had both school systems come and partnerships and parents and directors of board and superintendents and deans of education. And so we worked together to hear each other. And then we talked again in an advisory panel to look at how this affects mental health and how social workers are affected by this and psychologists and how they can continue to help with being with community outreach programs and workers as well. And so the work that I do in schools is based on a framework that I have theorized. My 3R narrative framework that I began that in 2013 because of the poverty program, and also some work that I've been doing with my university students. And it's a way to force us to really think deeply, and by living and telling our stories and our experiences of how we are, who we teach, why we teach, who are you as a person, what are the stories that you live by, and what are the stories that come through. And if we begin repeating those stories and living them and retelling them, then a revelation of sorts, even unconscious actions and beliefs come to the surface. And this happens every time. This happens. You hear about, even just writing or self-writing or self-reflection, or it's called deep learning or deep understanding. But if you're doing it with a purpose to change mindset, especially if you're working toward systemic issues in school systems or how it plays out in your curriculum, then it's a good way to understand it through your own experiences. And then a reformation, how, if you do, you change your mindset to reawaken new beliefs. I'm sure many of you, first of all, you're at this symposium, so I know you're here. I'm talking to the already converter, or people that want to know more about this. But if I asked many of you, were you thinking like this, or were you thinking about these topics 2 years ago, 4 years ago, 6 years ago? When did it become part of the repertoire of the work that you do? Maybe it was there, but is it urgent now? And so this is what I mean by really digging deeply. And I use this in my way to collect data of storied experiences of my participants. And so these are just voices of students. I think people need to have a wake-up call and just realize, why have appearances if it's not what it is? It is what it is. Just help people, just do what you can in every community. And this was a talk that the student gave in front of the trustees. I have to say, that moment, that was a few years back, that moment brought tears to some of the trustees in the panel. And you know that the high school youth that I was with, many of them were upset that there were tears. They wanted action. They didn't want tears. They didn't want pity. They told their stories. There were the student panel that came with me that night were students from all socioeconomic families, and all of them were upset that there were tears but not action. So that goes to show the power of youth voice to continue on pushing up against systemic barriers in schools. So the need for community and relationship partnership. When I grew up with my mom, she was a single mom with me and my brother, and we lived on the top floor of a house. And I thought that was like the best thing ever. Then, as I got older, I realized people are just rude and they'll put you down for something like that. In other words, living in poverty. So people who put you down for where they live is kind of messed up. And they'll be like, well, look at where I live. Look at what I have on. Look at my gear and look at what I wear. This student was not only talking about her peers, she was talking about her educators as well. This story of this girl is part of a larger story that I'm not going to share now, but the good news is I'm writing a book and it's going to be in a case. And it's one that really gets to the intimacy of microaggression, the intimacy of unconscious assumptions, the intimacy of stereotyping, not just from student to student peers, but also educator to student. And so we are not trying to blame the educator. I'm an educator where I continue to bump up against my own unconscious beliefs. We are trying to catch ourselves in those beliefs and trying to do better. And so a little mini activity, no breakout rooms, but just to think about it here. One of the larger stories is, I call it my you can go get your thing printed at Staples story. I just presented that at another talk recently. But imagine an educator who is trying to fulfill the expectations of an assignment, but there's no color printer at the school, there's no color. And to do an assignment of, let's just say, a brochure, you had to get it printed, it had to be in color. And so that's not accessible to every student. Well, not even, this is pre-pandemic I'm talking about. And so the largest story around this is a teacher saying finally to a student, when they kept pushing back against each other, you can go to Staples to get your thing printed if you want full marks, if you really want to do this. What's your problem? Don't you have a car? And so on. The story is bigger and bigger. I want to place this here to say, we all know here, we've been to the symposium here, this is a deficit way to speak, to believe, to enact. So what would you do if you hear a colleague, if you hear these real comments in your place of work? And another one, where do we put this student with the background they come from? There's no programming for them at our school. Now, this is both a reality. When I worked at rural schools, I had students that were just trying to get their academic science course in physics, and they couldn't get it because it wasn't at the school, and they didn't have access to go to another school. They didn't have access to travel. They were mostly white, working poor, farm, rural places, and this is what they were up against. How do we respond to these realities, and at the same time catch ourselves to say, man, this is a big issue. This is bigger than us. This is a systemic issue. So absolutely, we need, on one hand, the government to intervene, to do the things that they promised they would do, by the way, from 1989, because poverty was supposed to be eradicated by the year 2000, and it's worse than it was in 1989. But where do we go? What can we do at a school level? We can begin changing the way we speak, number one. We can say instead, we have a problem with programming at our school because it's not accessing all of our students. So let's get together with parents. And by the way, this is what we did. We got together with parents. We brainstormed for 2 nights. They talked about a busing system that would work, that they would each integrate. They talked about travel and taxis. They talked about everything to make a solution happen. So they're not asking for the superintendents or the directors to come down and fix it. They want that, but they're now at the level, most of these families say, can we fix this? And so having a conversation is important. And through those conversations in one particular school, there was a solution for this very dilemma. And so now I'm going to get to, I don't know how much time I have, and I'm looking at it. I don't know how much time I have, Lindy, but I really do want to get to stories of youth and teachers, and this is the guts of my research. And so I'm just going to really talk about Mr. T and Alexa. And Mr. T is really, this is about zooming in now into the classroom. He's a grade 11 teacher, and his efforts are on changing his mindset as he works towards implementing inclusive design and safe schools and cultural competency. And it's juxtaposed by a student voice who is Alexa. And she came to me one day and she said, I want to write a poem. And I've actually shown this poem in other talks, but it's the first time I'm actually juxtaposing it to Mr. T, who, by the way, was her teacher as well, one of her favorite teachers. And they both recognized that they were up against systemic issues and systemic barriers. And Alexa was suddenly thrown into poverty. her father left the home. Her mother did not work, and there was no money, and they had to go live with the grandmother. And then Alexa's life fell apart in the way that she took up her schooling. She was a very bright student. And she was one of my student participants and became one of pivotal members that wanted to speak out. And she wrote a poem. So like, these are the Amanda Gormans in our life, right? Where the spoken word is so effective. And she did that. And so I want to just share some of those voices. So this is Mr. T, and he says, hand-me-downs were a necessity. I remember wearing clothes with patches on my knees. And these are the stories he shares about how he lived in poverty. In grade 8, I was not engaged. My brother was the all-star student. He was the grade 8 valedictorian. He was revered by his grade 8 teacher. I had the same grade 8 teacher. I was completely disconnected. There was only one teacher that connected with me, and that was my French teacher. Anyway, I literally failed almost every subject in grade 8. And the recommendation was, oh, you really need to go down to that below general level. You need to go to the basic level. Well, my mom and dad, they were both immigrants. And so they're like, no, you're just lazy. You just don't want to do your work. So you're going to stay at the advanced level. So I went into grade 9, and my farewell speech from my grade 8 teacher was, good luck in life, Tony. You're really going to need it. And that was the reality. And my grade 8 teacher used to give me a swift kick in the ass. And I'd say, back in the day, that was corporal punishment, but that was allowed. So I got kicked in the ass by my teacher, back to the hands of my head to wake up. And it wasn't working. That's not the way I respond to learning. But back in the early 80s, that's the way things were. Actually, I was shocked by that was going on, but that was going on. That was still going on. And so he shares these stories with his students. He decided to start sharing. And with Alexa, her poem that she calls The Chasm, the great divide between how you get from one place to the next, and she couldn't jump over. And she says, I can't cross it. My friends and I walk the opposing cliffs, never quite meeting. They call me over, offering and ordering, you must, can't you go? To which I say, no, I cannot cross it. And she refers here to her friends that are asking her to go to the movie or to the prom or to the dance or whatever the music festival that she was part of. And at that point, she could not do it. And she has a voice to talk about that. And then Mr. T runs up into this issue. And this is where I want to talk about how singular these issues can be and how big they are. He says, I had a rough week. I did something I am not proud of, and it was an oversight in my part. I wrote the list of the cross-country runners and a student who made the team, a student I gave my shoes to and discreetly bought shirts for, was also on the list. Teachers have to activate the cash online system. Okay, so here's what I'm going to say here. The system of the school board, and many school boards, many of you might have this happening, there's an online cash system where for all field trips, for all student fees, for all everything it is, parents actually or families actually have to pay into the system. There's no cash money that goes in, feeds into the school systems anymore. So this was new when it was there like a year or so before I went into the system, and it backfired. And he posted the student's name and because he wanted to do the student, save the student dignity, he basically said, oh, I'll tell the secretary that we'll give the financial support. So he just put a little note on it, but forgot that he put the little note on it and then put the list of who made the cross-country team outside his door. And then he nonchalantly passed by and realized what he had done. And then he literally freaks out. And the day ended and I was walking by the class and I saw the list and what I had done. And I ran so fast. And I first got a Sharpie and I blacked it out and I ripped it down. And so you can see this almost like a Saturday Night Live skit. He's trying to save this, but he's ripping and it's worse because then he's blacking out the kid's name and it's disastrous. And he was so out of himself. He was so worried that he had to talk to a colleague about it. And he had then went to the office. So we think this is a little thing, but it was a big thing for Mr. T. He went to the administration. He was ashamed of his, he was catching himself at what he did and how can we make it better. The online system, the cash online system, was a barrier for many of his students. This is what Alexa writes about the barrier. Because Alexa also, when she suddenly was thrown into a life of a low income, could not pay for many of the things that she could pay for before. School is supposed to be what gets me closest to the other side. The chasm is but 2 feet wide, and yet I cannot cross it. Activities, for example, activities like the prom, like the music festival, activities like Crowbars Come, widening the gap. I cannot jump for fear of failing and falling. I cannot cross it. So Mr. T then decides to go on a whole course. He's getting a degree in Indigenous Studies, and he's studying now in different universities. He's taking courses at Queen's University now. And he says, I always tell my students that every child has a story and to never make assumptions. I share my story with students and let them know I have a story. And when I teach Indigenous Studies, students have an awakening. And he says they have to know the truth of what happened. I know teachers need to be involved in meaningful dialogue to understand. I think there are some insignificant, and here's the thing, he pushes up against what's happening in a system. There are some insignificant professional development sessions that could be better structured. And at that time, they were doing PD on, guess what? Online systems, accountability measures. And that wasn't working for a lot of teachers. They wanted to know how to service students that did not have resources and how to teach them in a better way. And so this shifting that happened for Mr. T, and a really deep dive on teaching poverty that allowed him the opportunity to make more visual connections. And Alexa on this, one of the things that was particularly bothered by her was that she was in grade 11. She only had 1 year to go. And she says, since grade 9, the ministry or the school board has been promising us so many things about better pathways to university, or a promise of access to identity or gender identity clubs at the school. And that didn't happen in her tenure at her high school. And this is how she writes it out. Others come from the other side, call upon a force like Goliath. The man boldly steps up, declares decrees to help me. The bridge half built. The man steps down, finish it yourself, yet still I cannot cross it. So how does a 16, maybe going on 17-year-old student understand the complexities of policy and politics and education? She knows it because she knows she did not get a proper education, in her opinion, of what should be a given for all students, because she did not have the resources. And so finally, Mr. T's passion for his course, it's related to his learning, to attending the workshops and the sensitivity training and the Indigenous Studies and the coursework and program that he's doing on his own regard. So he has teamed up with Indigenous colleagues and people in the system. And he says, I join in the sharing circle with my Indigenous colleague with a feather that my colleague had gifted me. My students appreciate these events and really embrace the concept of being present. What he also does is he changes a course. In fact, there's Indigenous Studies courses at this Catholic school that had to be approved, as you can imagine, by the bishop, by the diocese. And the bishop then came in and apologized to the students, and the students asked questions. And Alexa is now in university, And she's made it to the other side. And this is what she wrote. You are less, it tells me, whispers quietly, the other side rejects you. No, you cannot cross it, crying and crazed. I make a mad dash for hope, the future, my dignity. Believe it or not, I cross it. She's at university now, and she is still communicating with me. She basically said that, I'm just trying to find it. She shares that she's been networking. She's doing business and the economy. And she said that she was enlightened by our project, because I spent about 3 years with her, grade 10, 11, 12. With the Ontario Student Assistant Grant Loan, she is able to attend university, studying at the same time, continuing her success despite the chasm that she actually finally crossed. She shares that she has been networking, quote unquote, across the city, and she ran successfully for student government in Ottawa U, and she's learned more about how businesses interact with our society. And she said, so Darlene, or she calls me Dr. D, I'm putting my OSAP money to good use. So it's a success story despite the plight that she lived. So I don't know how much time I have. The other part of this is really about my youth strategy that I have worked with within the 2 school boards, and I wanted to show you some documents as well.
Darlene, we have about 12 minutes left, and I don't want to leave some time for questions. So I leave it up to you to use the time, but that's what we have.
Thank you. Okay, so I do want to say, I'm going to use about 5 minutes maybe, because I do want to show that there is a way to do this. I have teamed up this book. You can get this online at the Durham District School Board. Shout out to those of you from Durham today. Hey. They really let me do lots of longitudinal research in their board, and the good, the bad, and the ugly has shown up. You have to come face on with what's not working, and the teachers and schools that I worked with really came to the base around that. That's really about these 3 things. I came up with 3 pillars of opportunity: building a culture of care, developing community partnerships, and enhancing professional development knowledge with all these partners.
Darlene, could you repeat the name of the resource, please, and we can put it into the chat box?
Yes, it's the Youth Strategy Research Partnership is my report, and then there's another one called the Youth Poverty. You know what? I'm going to send it to you, Lindy. Okay, Lindy, I'll send you all the.
Awesome. Okay. We'll put it in our resources.
No problem. And so we also have an advisory board here that constitutes all the systems that I've worked with, and all the other ones, including like MISA, which is the Managing Information of Student Achievement, the Ontario College of Teachers, Niagara Poverty Reduction Networks, the Social Justice Research. We have speakers like Britta B, who comes and does some fantastic work. We have musicians that have come in. So there's a lot of gatherings around this, but just to see that the intersectionality of all these things with poverty is really important to deconstruct and untangle. And so here's a picture, Lindy, of all these resources. They're there right now. I forgot that. So 1, 2, 3. And then the other ones that we should be looking at again. I mean, we have our A Better Way Forward, our Ontario 3-year anti-racism strategic plan. I know they have a compendium actually this month to look through that too, and to use it in your systems. But building, and I can share these slides, building a culture of care, and just the recommendations, and the resources have the recommendations, they have indicators, evidence of, and just to create your own PD. It's probably a great compendium to the research that I've done prior, and the work that I'm mobilizing right now too. So building a culture, like considering your school rules, seeking to understand your parents, implementing innovative strategies beyond teachers and families. And so this is not new to anybody here, but it is in relation to poverty. Okay. And then how do you engage partnerships and relationships? I do a deep dive on how to do that in a lot of my research writing. And I have one of my, a few of my articles that I can also send to Lindy on that. And then enhancing practice and knowledge, really looking at, we know that we've been trained and PD'd on equity-based action research projects, but how do then the youth voice take that and move toward owning that and then shifting curriculum. Mr. T and Alexa is a good example. They're little things that become big changes. So that school, even though they could not change the online cash system, they revitalized, they revamped entirely so that whole thing that happened to Mr. T would not happen again, on how to maneuver around that. But the students then become involved in that, okay? And so I'm coming to the end here, but you know, we have to quote Nelson Mandela, because it's Nelson Mandela. And this is one of probably the citations I go to the most, because it does say adamantly that poverty is an issue of equity. Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is an act of justice. It is the protection of a fundamental human right and the right to dignity and a decent life. And if we put that in our back bumper of our car, in our front mirror, in our classroom as a poster, and it reminds us, because in every classroom that we teach, we do have people living in low income, and that resources are not accessible to them. So I'll end now. Oh, and also this is you can contact me anytime. And we'll end the sharing now.
Before Leah thanks you, let's see if we have any questions, Darlene. I know we've had lots of comments in the chat as you've been presenting, but perhaps people have some questions.
Sure.
We're at the end of a long day of learning, and we've still got one small session, so I don't want to lose people, but if there are any questions, this would be the moment.
I know some people have said hi to me, and I know some people in there and some colleagues from Brock Youth. Thank you for sticking around. It is, it's a long day, and these are heavy topics as well.
I have a question. It's a bit of a complex question. I think that we often don't focus on poverty as an identity or an issue on its own, because it's so wrapped up in all of these intersectionalities. And I guess, like, how do you balance these discussions about poverty and barriers with the fact that sometimes I've seen socioeconomic status used in that kind of like colorblind way? I know I'm not phrasing this very well, but that's kind of the question that I have about this, looking at this as kind of like a central issue, is like, how do we make sure that we're also maintaining that awareness of intersectionality when we do work on this issue?
So Belinda, you're right. I don't know if I understand the question, but I can answer. It is the issue, and you have to, it intersects with so many things. I'm a white privileged woman, but I grew up as an ethnic minority living in poverty. So there was my poverty, and I was an ethnic minority. Absolutely, we have BIPOC, Black, Indigenous students of color, and many of them are not living in poverty. Many of them are. And so how can you not see both? You know, Charmaine gave a great talk, and it was what I've written about in I call it the Green Book, the poverty book on elementary schools, is that you cannot assume just because students look and talk in a certain way that they live in poverty. But we should be assuming that we teach a diverse society, and we are a microcosm in our classrooms of our larger society, and our larger society has all those facets in it. And so it should not be something singular that we talk about poverty. It should be a given that we talk about, this is an issue that that has its effects in systemic barriers. And so what we should be talking about is how our systems work and how our systems need to change. So if this pandemic is going to do something, for example, Belinda, if it can put the spotlight on technology and lack of technology accessibility for 1 in 7 children and youth, that's a big issue. So we have to talk about that. We have to talk about what can be done in systems to say if we can no longer operate to teach our students without proper bandwidth for every family, we can't do that. So we have to have the government and schools work together to do that. So I guess what I'm trying to say, Belinda, we cannot put it on the back burner. It has to be in the front burner with everything else. And it's part of our makeup, part of our fabric of our society. It's not something that, oh God, I have a poor kid in my class. What am I going to do about the poor? Even just saying that, the way it's such a deficit way of thinking, or I don't have the resources, then we scream that out loud. I don't have the resources and we have to change that. I think I've answered it a bit. I'm not sure, Belinda.
Thanks, Darlene. There's one other question from Dean Owen. I can't let the conference end without Dean Owen having his.
And I'm so happy Dean Owen is here.
And he's asking, for teacher educators, how do we insert your research into our teacher education program?
Sorry, Lindy, how do we
insert your research into our teacher education program?
Mike, come into my class. I was gonna, so absolutely, it's a fantastic question. And so the way I teach my students in all my university classes, whether I teach one course and it's an identity course, the first pre-service course. I also teach a literacy course. So what was I teaching in my literacy course this term, fall term? Absolutely, you take on what's happening in our world. Of course, the Black Lives Matter and how that intersects with poverty. And those were the resources that I use with storybooks and how to do my 3R framework and how to really think deeply of who they are. I say to my teacher candidates, you cannot teach without knowing who you are first. Parker Palmer says this, right? And who you are first. Don't shush away the things that you're shameful of, because those very things that you don't want to talk about. And believe it or not, when all my report cards used to say, when I was failing, she's too quiet, she's pains to grow, and I was in trauma because I didn't know what was happening to me. I couldn't speak a language. I was living in poverty. I couldn't articulate that. So now I speak about that. I don't shame that away. And so I try and teach my teacher candidates to understand that their own complexities, to be able to understand issues of poverty and systemic discrimination. And you can only understand, the other thing is to understand stories, because you can only understand the best of another person's context that's not your own through understanding their stories. And that's why my research is lived in stories, right? In keynotes like this, I only give clippets of it, but in my research and in my coursework, we study it in depth, the storied experiences of people in education. I hope that answers that, Michael.
Awesome. Leah, over to you.
Thank you, Darlene. Thank you for your insight and your thinking and your stories, which really point to the ways in which schools can best support children and their families so that they can fully participate. I think your talk really compels us to think about the systemic barriers that families living in poverty face in education, and how we can work to dismantle those barriers one step at a time, and how to improve overall access and equity. So thank you. And now I will hand it off to Susan and Peter.
Thank you, and good afternoon.